This movie, in my opinion, has one of the best cult followings out there. And no, I'm not talking about Caroline. I'm talking about the masterpiece known as Coraline. You remember that movie, right? The beautifully crafted stop-motion animation film from Laika Studios that was directed by Henry Selick, whom also directed The Nightmare Before Christmas. If you're like most of us Coraline enthusiasts who were left enthralled, you want more, a sequel. Especially after seeing what Laika was capable of achieving in one of their later films titled Kubo and the Two Strings. It leaves us fantasizing of what a Coraline sequel with its amazing lore paired with Laika's newer technology could look like today. So much so that we seek out alternatives. We're curious to know how other creative minds would reimagine the world of Coraline, or should I say, the other world. The thing is though, that you might forget, like myself, that the rip-off market out there is desperate to bring eyes to their product. So they ride the coattails of other more popular films, even if it had the most minute of inspiration to incorporate into their films. And they do this to bait in suckers like myself. And that is how my insatiable longing for more Coraline brought me to this disarrayed chain of events titled Caroline and the Magic Potion. Now, this movie feels a lot like it was written by a person, an inebriated person who's incognizant of characterization. Now, before we get to what this movie is about, I want to point out what I presume are the elements of Coraline that inspired Caroline. First off, the obvious one that's begging us to associate it with Coraline is the name Caroline, although it's disrespecting its source material because Coraline doesn't take too kindly when her name is mispronounced. But disrespecting others isn't something that Caroline shies away from. I'll get to that momentarily. Second of all, let's take a look at that outfit.
Ew! Dude! What the fuck?
But enough with the superficiality. Let's get to the character work. You know how Coraline gives her parents a little attitude. She resents them for being neglectful. There's a nuance to her behavior. Well, in this movie, they took that characteristic from Coraline and rewrote it as the most basic stereotype. They turned Caroline into a disrespectful child. And maybe, since Caroline is portrayed in this way, it was intentional to name her Caroline, since it disrespects Coraline. The way the dynamic between the parental figures and the children is conveyed really shows you just how much of a lesser movie Caroline is. Coraline's parents are emotionally unavailable, and that is integral to the story. In Caroline, the grandma seems to be a tinge too aggressive and not very understanding of her granddaughter. But that doesn't exactly make us sympathize with Caroline, because she's rude. But also, they're only characterized this way for a small portion of the movie. Once a certain event occurs, that I will momentarily get to, this conflicting dynamic is abandoned. This movie just isn't written very well. Coraline had some very interesting supportive characters. One of them was Wybie, but Caroline has a flying instructor as a friend who's named Salou, who's a bit too old to be hanging around Caroline. Let me correct myself. Salou is either a skydiving or some sort of parachute flying instructor. You have to be 18 years of age to acquire a skydiving license. Then you have to go through a 3-year course to become an instructor. So Salou is approximately 21 years of age. And I mention this because throughout the film there seems to be some sort of subtext going on between Caroline and Salou. And she's maybe about between 11 and 13.
FBI, open up!
Yeah, This movie seems like it deviated a little too much from what we knew and loved. You know, the story, the plot, the character motivations, they just have no semblance to its source material. So the movie follows Caroline, who lives in an RV with her grandma, which we know because it's confirmed via the plot summary and not the film itself. There's never any mention of Caroline's parents, nor is there any hidden clues that could vaguely let us know who they are or if they're even present in her life. The grandma concocts remedies and sells them out of the RV, similar to a food truck. Caroline and her grandma refer to themselves as healers. And not only do they whip up remedies, but the grandma also cooks up magic potions. Yup, that's right, they dabble with magic. And since magic and spells are a part of their culture, Caroline lets us know that they are healers and not witches. Although it isn't specified what discerns a healer from a witch, and Coraline seems to have a bit of apprehension towards being misidentified as a witch, even though later in the movie, there's a recall to the Salem witch trials and she seemed to be sympathetic towards that. So then, why was she defensive about being called the witch? Who knows? It's not like this movie was made to tell a proper story anyways. So Caroline is snooping around her grandma's belongings, looking for a flying potion so that she can prove to her not so age-appropriate skydiving instructor friend that flying magic exists, in hopes that Salou will recruit her for the Flyers Club. Now, the Flyers Club is either a group of friends who go parachute flying, or that's the company that Salou works for. But who knows, because once again, this film is so scarce with its information. Now, naturally a question you'll have in mind and expect the movie to address is why Caroline wants to join the Flyers Club. Even though her wanting to join is brought up again, Caroline's motivations are never crystallized, unless you read into the subtext. We then see the grandma being confronted by this dude who has the appearance of a Limp Bizkit fan. He threateningly tells her to sign the contract, like the others have. A certain Maria is mentioned, and the grandma promptly shouts for her. But they don't tell us who she is. They give us no reason to keep her in mind. Although they do eventually reveal who she is, her role in the movie ends up being as insignificant as the first time she was mentioned. There's no context given to what's occurring. Things just seem to be happening because they're attempting to make a movie. There's even some scenes that seemingly were meant to be cut out, but are left in because they probably didn't meet the time quota. The way the very thin yet tediously convoluted plot progresses reminds me of compositions we wrote as kids at school, when the teacher gives you carte blanche to write a story, but since our storytelling capabilities aren't as refined, things just seem to be happening with not much structure or interwoven narrative. After the grandma was threatened, her and Caroline dip, but she notices that they are being followed by the Limp Bizkit fan in a motorcycle. Meanwhile, Caroline is in the back fantasizing, somewhat romanticizing flying with Salou. Hold up, let's take it back a notch. Before the grandma spotted the Limp Bizkit fan, Caroline is getting a phone call from Salou. So she unbuckles her seatbelt, walks over to her grandma, tries to take the cell phone, but then gets told to shut it off. But of course, she answers the phone call in a very condescending tone. I mean, just take a look.
What are you doing? Sit down and put your seatbelt on.
But somebody's calling me.
Turn that thing off.
Oops, I answered.
It's that added disrespect that makes Caroline's character annoying. And this is the main character we're supposed to care for. Okay, let's fast forward back to where we were at. Right, Caroline daydreaming about Salou. So Salou is actually outside flying in the parachute. Why is this 20-year-old tracking down Caroline? Anyways, having spotted Salou, that prompts Caroline to use the flying potion on an umbrella. But Caroline, not being educated in the arts of aviation, She doesn't know how to conduce the umbrella, so she loses control and flies out of the RV. And the grandma, watching in fear, witnessing her granddaughter flying out, gets distracted and crashes into a tree. That's right, if you didn't already dislike this child, she has now caused her elderly grandma to crash, to get into a car accident. And this accident gives leeway to the Limp Bizkit guy to kidnap the grandma. It turns out he's a stooge, a lackey, for a manufacturing company that produces cosmetic products. The reason they're after the grandma is because they use the recipes that they take away from healers that they keep in their building for their products. Yup, they're low-key running a healer sweatshop. There was one product that was put to use, and it was put to use by whom I'm guessing is the CEO of the company. And you really have to guess, because the movie doesn't tell you. Well, her name is Lola, and she uses this product to shrink her breasts and her ass. With the introduction of this manufacturing company is where the plot gets convoluted, because they try to add complexity to the movie by attempting to do a commentary on global warming. The company is called EcoNatural. I mean, you can see what they were going for there with that name. And it's mentioned that they have polluted a lake. The subject of pollution is referenced sporadically, but there's never any good metaphors or depictions of environmental awareness substantial enough to convey a well thought out message. It's all devoid of substance. Also, since the EcoNatural employees are the antagonists, two of them in particular are fixated with vanity. They're creating products that fixes, at least from their perspective, what they consider flaws. I'm presuming the message they are conveying here is to accept yourself, to embrace your genetics. The message here suffers the same insubstantial insight as the previous one did. However, I will acknowledge that the breast minimizing product could be helpful to some women. So after the crash, it puts the whole film into perspective. I should call it a movie. This is not a film. Anyways, so Coraline has to break into EcoNatural and rescue her grandma. Now, you would think that the journey to get there would spur off an arc of character development where Coraline would evolve from a disrespectful kid into something admirable that your child could see, and it would provide something of value to their impressionable minds, right? Yeah, no, that doesn't happen. At the very least, we can find some solace in that Coraline isn't a gremlin for the rest of the film. Nothing noteworthy happens throughout this journey. There's a lot of inept moments that take place. Many moments that leave you perplexed on why they chose to go in that direction. Some of the plot devices that are introduced are baffling. Like the EcoNatural stooge is being mind controlled with a Bluetooth device. Yeah, you remember that archaic piece of technology from the Cretaceous period? It's never explained how it functions, so you could just assume they're using the healer's magic to power it. Another plot device that is used is this healer exclusive sign language, and it consists of doing these rock and roll horns. So I noticed a bit of a trend: environmental awareness, the rock and roll devil horns, the message of loving yourself, and Coraline and her older man friend. And then I spotted a Woodstock poster in the background of the RV. And that's where I had the epiphany. A hippie had to have written this movie. I mean, it makes sense. Someone dropped a little too much acid and they came up with this. Just to describe to you the ineptitude in the writing. After the grandma gets abducted, the stooge returns to the scene of the crash. Although it still hasn't been pronounced a crime scene, legally speaking, since the cop is oblivious to the abduction, the lackey returns while Coraline is there though, and presents himself as a mechanic to gain access to the RV And even though he isn't in the slightest dressed in a mechanic's uniform and also doesn't have any of the tools, and don't let me go on without mentioning that no one called for a mechanic's assistance, the cop permits him to go into the RV. Coraline inadvertently puts the cop to sleep with some magic powder, so that allows the lackey to attack, and he assaults Salou, hangs him up on a tree, then cuffs Coraline and places her inside the RV. After Coraline manages to escape, she informs Salou that her grandma has been kidnapped, and he tells her that she's crazy for thinking that even though he just got his ass handed to him and witnessed what he did to Coraline. That right there was a nice full scoop of how inept this movie is. But don't worry, it doesn't stop there. Coraline gets FaceTimed by her grandma, who is tied up in a chair at the behest of Lola. Then, like every criminal who doesn't want their identity exposed, she enters the FaceTime call that can be recorded, thus incriminating herself. This movie is frustrating to the point that even those who always counter argue with "it's a children's movie" could never defend this. Lola wants the grandma's recipes, and she tells Coraline that she'll exchange her the grandma for one of those recipes, even though she could have totally saved herself the time and possibly kept herself out of jail by putting one of those mind-controlling Bluetooth devices on the grandma to get those recipes out of her, like she did with the other healers who she's kept under mind control. And by the way, that's where Maria is. She's been kept under mind control at the manufacturing company. I'm not going to be apologetic when I say this, but how acid fried is the brain who wrote this? They're literally creating plot holes when the plot device to write a competent story are available because they wrote them into the screenplay. But it seems like they're deliberately creating ways to ignore them while also still keeping them in the story going forward. Anyways, Coraline ends up journeying into the forest to locate the eco-natural building. She somewhat knows where to go because Salou knows about the manufacturing company and had a general sense of its location. Also, the grandma had a map. Once she breaks into the building, she's captured and is forced to make the recipe. In the middle of concocting it, the grandma gives her a different recipe that creates a super glue of sorts. And when the eco-natural characters apply it, they end up stuck. After this, they get into some action sequences that'll rival the MCU.
Ugh, that was disgusting.
So at its conclusion, they just escape, and this cop character that I excluded from mentioning because he just has little to no importance, he arrests Lola and that other bald guy. I told you, she shouldn't have shown herself in that FaceTime call. This movie, it's an atrocity, but even more baffling is that this is a byproduct of Coraline. It's just baffling that with the cognitive capabilities a Homo sapien has, after watching Coraline, they created this. I know, I might sound a little too harsh, but just watch it for yourself. And I think you'll come to the same conclusion. After watching this movie, it was clear to me that this would have benefited from being shorter, maybe about 20 to 25 minutes. It would have been a better product. But of course, they were going for a movie, not an episode, although it should have been one. Anyways, if you reached the end of this video, thank you for watching, and I appreciate your time. If you enjoyed what you just watched, hit like, give me a subscribe, share, do the thing that YouTube likes you to do. Thank you, appreciate it.